El próximo año ya serán 16 años.
So next year, we're going to turn 16. Let's hope we're all here then. And now let's talk about some of the most important challenges. And for that, we have journalist Marisa Rodriguez, who will be chairing a panel with very knowledgeable experts. Thank you, Mimi. When I was asked to chair this panel, I thought about how important it would be for journalists to be able to talk about precisely what we're going to be talking about today: reducing poverty, trying to make sure that everybody can have their opportunities, the empowerment of women, sustainability. And this is something that is really very important for citizens. And it is extremely important for the 3 million low-income entrepreneurs who have enjoyed the support of the foundation. The foundation works through strategic priorities, such as inclusion, empowerment of women, sustainability, and education. Those are the basic pillars of the foundation. These are pillars which are present across all national and international agendas, but they have featured in the foundation's agenda for many years, since 2007. And it is also very important for the foundation to measure the effect of its policies, because if you don't measure something, it's very difficult, to see whether you are successful or not. And poverty should not only be measured in terms of revenues. Poverty is also reflected in our dwellings, or in our health systems, or our education systems. To talk about all this, we have our experts. Andres Alaman, Secretary General of the Latin American or Ibero-American Secretariat. Please join me. On the panel, Michelle Bousset, Senior Advisor for Human Development from Oxford University. She was recently appointed new director of the UN Programme for Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Sophie Certain, Chief Executive Officer of CGAP, which is an independent think tank devoted to financial inclusion associated to the World Bank. And finally, Javier Flores, Director General of the BBVA Microfinance Foundation. So I think you should move a little bit so that I can be at the center. So let's start with one first question I would like to ask you. In your opinion, in the last 15 years, what has been the major step taken towards sustainable development? Well, before anything else, I would like to greet Her Majesty, the bank's management. They have really been visionary, and they should be proud of that. I have no doubt that the most important thing that happened in the last 15 years in terms of sustainability, and this is something the first Vice President mentioned, is the adoption of the SDGs as a core concept. If you look at the different countries find it difficult to find common programs, and sometimes the differences that exist make it impossible for those common programs to be articulated. So for the world to have a global development program with targets, ambitions, and calls, which has really changed the concept of development, and this is a major step forward. For me, for these SDGs to exist, and for countries to realize them, and for companies to incorporate them, and for civil society organizations to transform themselves into activists to defend these SDGs is, for me, the most significant change that has taken place in the last few years. Your Majesty, bank managers, I couldn't agree more with the Vice President and with the General Secretary of the Ibero-American Secretariat. I think that the most significant advance in the last 15 years has been to recognize that development needs to be sustainable. Otherwise, it cannot be called development. And this has many implications. We cannot just construe development without regard to sustainability, because everything should be considered a multidimensional phenomenon, and multidimensionality is of great importance, and the definition of multidimensionality should be defined by the people themselves. And if our public policies do not look at this multiple dimensions, then we will get nowhere. So if development needs to be sustainable, it's not enough for it to be inclusive, and it's not enough to embark on multiple dimensions. We should also be aware of the limitations imposed by nature. It is very important to understand that the effort of governments is not enough. The active cooperation of all the sectors of society is very important, and the Foundation is a clear example of how the private sector and the NGOs working together with the people, not just working for the people, but working hand in hand with the people, we can move towards this sustainable development.
Sophie, well, first, I would like to thank all the authorities, and I would like to thank you for inviting me to take part in this very interesting roundtable. And I agree with what we've already said, but I'm going to take it to the financial world. For me, some of the most important developments, more transformational changes in the last decade are specifically the acknowledgement of the key role that financial inclusion can play when it comes to building a more inclusive, resilient world. And we've seen this, for example, when we take a look at organizations that design financial standards such as the Basel Committee or the Financial Stability Board, which up until a decade ago would only focus or were mainly focusing on ensuring financial stability, and now they've included within their standards proportionality goals, which, for example, what these do is they acknowledge that financial stability and financial inclusion must go hand in hand in order to ensure safety. And we see this with international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which have developed the index we've mentioned earlier, the FINDEX, which is an financial inclusion index, which didn't exist a decade ago, and they've included their assessment of the financial environment. So not only financial stability, but financial inclusion modules. Countries, as we've already seen, have seen a huge increase in what we've done. They've developed strategies, financial inclusion strategies. On the other hand, the private sector, just like the BBVA, has already proven for the whole sector. We've also, this has been acknowledged much more than it was before, that we have to really not only need to get financial results, but social impact. And this is transforming into an actual rule. And I think that this is very important development. Javier? Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank Her Majesty, the backing you've given the Foundation for so many years, and for being our honorary chair. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the Vice President, her presence, and of course, Carlos Torres, the CEO for BBVA. Again, the chair for BBVA. And I agree wholeheartedly with what my colleagues have said. And when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, the organization, ever since 2015, we've been part of the private sector group that had been backing the UN, the US in New York, and we're one of the international organizations that took part in back then in 2015 when the SDGs started appearing. But if I had to focus only on the foundation and go down to brass tacks, I would say that the technological revolution and the digital transformation have been key aspects in these last 15 years for the foundation, because we have to acknowledge that the disruption technology has wrought, and digitalization has allowed hundreds of thousands of people, we're talking about 1.5 billion people in the last 15 years. And this has given people the opportunity of democratize, to have a universal access to formal financial services. And I think that this is a key aspect of the last 15 years. And at the same time, I believe that all this technology we're receiving is something that is very, very important when it comes to offering accessibility to matters as important as health, education, and access to information. I think that everyone has to have access to this. So I would say that if I had to focus on my experience, I would say that technology and digitalization have been key. Mr. Alamand, given our current situation in Latin America after the pandemic and such an unstable global economy, what are the key challenges for your region? I know it's a huge question. What are the key challenges, and what do you think is the best way to tackle them? Well, Latin America is a land of opportunity, but like you said, it's also a land of challenges, as you very cleverly pointed out. And if I had to connect this to what concerns us, I think that the key challenges Latin America has ahead, the three ones, are fostering growth, improving its governability, and increasing trust. And we have to do these things hand in hand. As for fostering growth, Latin America has a debt. I wouldn't say a huge breach, but we're lagging a little bit behind. 40 years ago, we talked about Latin America, given its low growth, had a lost decade. It's been 40 decades, and in this decade, we're talking about a lost decade once again. So, fostering growth, I think, is a key priority. Carlos mentioned the impact microfinance has on families' lives, and I'm sure we'll discuss the impact it has, especially on women. But financial inclusion has a global impact. Financial inclusion gets rid of the informality that torments Latin America. When we improve the formality of financial relationships, we improve productivity, and when we improve productivity, we increase the likelihood of growth. And when we increase the likelihood of growth, there are more and more opportunities to defeat poverty and to get rid of inequality, which is why I think it's so important to think of this initiative that the foundation has presented, because it has a direct impact. It's direct action and has a global impact on this, well, to-do list Latin America has, which is to increase its prosperity, to improve our democracy, and higher social capital. Michelle, could you talk to us about the multidimensional poverty index, what it measures, and how it affects the most important aspects such as housing, education, and health? So before tackling the index itself, I'm going to build on what you said when we started the roundtable and what Her Majesty mentioned. Poverty is a multidimensional aspect. Historically, all countries all over the world, Europe, Latin America, all countries, we've understood poverty as a lack of income. And so that's how we've tackled poverty. So that's how we've measured it, and we've tackled it like that when it came to public policy. But like we mentioned earlier, but it's not because Oxford decided to talk about it like this, but it's because people who live in poverty, from the moment we start communicating with them and we see what means to live in poverty, you see that that is a multidimensional aspect. Let's think about our well-being. Poverty and well-being are two sides of the same coin, and our well-being at the end, well, obviously our income plays a huge role, but it's not the only aspect. So let's think of our well-being. Well, we'll think of health, our opportunities to have income, to have a dignified life, having a roof over our heads, having access to education, or guaranteeing education for our children. So Oxford University has developed a methodology to capture these lacks that simultaneously have an impact on people's lives. This is a different aspect. We don't live access or non-access to health independently of our education. Everything happens at the same time, and we can't tackle it when it comes to public policy or private policies as different separate realities. This index allows you to, once you apply it, to see not only who lives in poverty, given their lacks, but how that poverty is designed, how it changes from person to person, from region to region, how it varies from adults and children, men and women, how intense it is, and how this intensity fluctuates. So this is a very strong public policy tool, and I don't like using it as an index, but as a tool to make choices. And if we go to a personal level, I believe that this is a tool that allows us to properly channel our love for neighbors, and this is a love we can all feel, but we sometimes don't know how to externalize love for our neighbors properly. And in order to not go on and on and on, even though this index is tackled between the PNUD, the UNDP, and the OPHI, this has been adopted by about 100 countries as an official poverty measure beyond income poverty. And these national indices are unique for each country because they reflect each country's public policy. This methodology has been translated into the private field, and this is the appropriate moment to mention this. And even though it had reached the private field, and there are companies that are taking advantage to see what their collaborators have lacks, but the foundation is the first one to use it not only to measure what happens with their collaborators, but with their clients. And this complements monetary solutions. Very important, without a doubt. Sophie, according to the last Global Findex report, financial inclusion has increased during the pandemic. And even though this is positive, there's data that shows that poverty is increasing in the coming years. Well, it will keep on increasing. How can we explain this paradox? Well, you are very right, and it is true that for the first time in 3 decades, poverty has grown as a consequence of the pandemic, and the World Bank estimates that about 100 million people have gone below the extreme poverty threshold because of the pandemic. And that's, given our inflationary and our food crisis, well, this is also having an impact. And the World Bank is estimating that the impact of the climate crisis could lead 132 more million people below this threshold, and this could be a result for 2030, about 7% of the world population. This is 600 million people under extreme poverty instead of the 3% we had set for ourselves as a goal. And Javier, like you mentioned, it is true that before the pandemic, this accelerated during the pandemic. We've seen public investment in digital infrastructure in many countries. So, for example, Indian stacks are a very well-known model which have given rise to financial inclusion, especially digital financial inclusion, which is very relevant. And in the whole world, we've mentioned the Findex, which has been mentioned earlier. This has shown that the amount of people who have a financial account as of today has gone from 63% to 71%. In Latin America, had the highest growth all over the world. 18% in order to reach 73% of all adults. Now, it is important to understand that having a bank account isn't the end of the road. That isn't our goal. There are several challenges ahead, basically. First, 1.4 billion people don't even have a bank account. And these are the poorest of the poor, the people who live in rural areas. Most of them are women, but we'll mention this later. We're talking about young migrants. So we're talking about people who are already in an unstable situation and they don't even have a bank account. And like I was mentioning, having a bank account is not enough to ensure inclusive development, to ensure that people can take advantage of the economic opportunities we have had. You need savings, you need credit, you need insurance in order to be able to face the shocks that life sends their way. So there are challenges. So to me, beyond being a paradox, what we have ahead is an opportunity. We have an opportunity to basically take advantage of this digitalization, which we've mentioned in Latin America, in order to face this poverty, which keeps on growing and including more people, and to create a more inclusive future. And we know what we have to do, because what happened during the pandemic is we have the model. We know that digitalization and creating connectivity, taking connectivity to rural areas, digitalizing public payment, private payments, developing people, we can do this. Developing people as agents. We're not going to only talk about statistics, but about people. Javier, the foundation has been backing millions of people. You've been on the ground. What do you think of the work you've done? Well, summarizing 15 years in 2 minutes is going to be quite the feat. We've mentioned some figures here. The chair for BBVA said we've had an impact on 6 million people, with an indirect impact of about 18 to 20 million people. $18 million on an average of $1,000 per credit just this year in 2022. It's been a learning process, a continuous learning process, and we've learned of and from and with our clients. It's been very intense. We've tried to position the foundation in areas where banks aren't there, where people don't want to go, remote areas, rural areas, where we've gone to fields, basically peri-urban areas, because that's where poor people will have the least opportunities. So we've bet hard on technology. We've tried to digitalize our operations, but we've started digitalizing everything. This isn't only our financial services, but education, training people when it comes to digital activity, and it's been a wonderful process. We've learned, like Sophie mentioned, it's not about having a bank account, it's using a bank account and using it responsibly. And responsible use means training and walking with our clients. This isn't just giving a credit, this is accompanying people, the families, for however long, 5, 6, 8, 10 years. We've learned a lot, but what we've learned most of our entrepreneurs is the resiliency and the adaptability and the talent to reinvent themselves they have. And we've seen that 73% of our clients had seen their income reduced when compared to pre-pandemic levels. And this 73%, 36% had gone below 50%, and 20% lost everything. And these people have reinvented themselves and they've made their way. And like we mentioned here, if you don't measure it, it doesn't exist. In 2011, we launched our Social Security report, and we've been measuring this for over 10 years. We've got data and information from our clients for over 10 years, and we started measuring their vulnerability, what made their business be what they were, what margins they had, how they could generate assets. But we realized that that's important, but we couldn't stay there. We had to go one step beyond. And we have to encourage them to save, to think of any problems that can appear in their lives. And so floods, droughts, if you're sick, you can't go on. We started looking for, when we met Michelle, we started to be worried about what lacks our clients have beyond monetary poverty, how they live, what conditions they find themselves in at a home level. What do they have, what they don't have when it comes to health, when it comes to access to drinking water, access to health services, home. And we've tried to take this into account to improve their quality of life. And finally, we're analyzing digital poverty, how poor our clients are from a digital point of view, but having access and being able to afford a cell phone and being able to access networks. And this has taken a huge amount of work, and I'm very, very proud of it, especially thanks to our teams. Our American teams are following us, and all of our American people here, people we've learned with and from. And honestly, I'm very proud, and I'm very happy to have been able to lead this part of the foundation in which this learning process has matured. And I think that we are a beacon in the development world. Well, thank you very much for all of your knowledge and empathy-laden messages, which will help us write a much more optimistic story for Latin America and the rest of the world. Thank you very much, all four of you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.